What is going on, gunfighters? Saddle up for another episode of Gunfighter Life, where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, the right way, with God Almighty at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. Gonna forego a lengthy bio today. First and foremost, a Christian, military, law enforcement, private contracting experience, etc. You can listen to another episode for a more complete bio. Anyway, with that, today's episode is kind of morphed in the brain. I was going to talk about tactical guns from days of yore. I was mostly thinking still modern guns, like semi-automatic, from let's say the Cold War era and before, World War II, Cold War. They're still fairly modern, but for example, the FAL. Then it started morphing into my head, and I started thinking, why have some designs stood the test of time and progressed, while others kind of fade into obscurity? You don't see, when you walk into a lot of gun stores today, a FAL variant hanging on the wall. But you'll usually find a bunch of AR-15 variants, even though both are kind of 50s tech if you think about it. You might think as the AR is like the new hot scary black rifle, at least that's how it's often painted, but that thing's from the 50s. It's like a 57 Chevy. The design is not new, not revolutionary, again from the 50s. Adapted from the AR-10, which was designed, I believe, by Eugene Stoner as a hunting rifle. Adopted by the military, made less powerful. But that thing's from the 50s, the design. Why have some designs stood the test of time, while others have faded into history and obscurity? Not making them bad for the time, but not able to keep up with the pack, let's say. They've been put out to pasture, is a nice way to put it. Why have some guns been put out to pasture while others soldier on? So let's be circumspect here. Let me do some philosophizing here for you today on my thoughts on this subject. Now, even if you've heard the full-length bio, I'm not a professional historian. I don't have my doctorate in battle rifle studies because that doesn't exist. That'd be pretty cool. But there are guys out there that know way more about the FAL and the G3 and stuff than I do. They can tell you like this variant means this, and this was used by the Panamanian paratroopers. I don't know that much. But I have a basic understanding of the FAL and the G3 and things like it. So since I've already kind of mentioned that, let's talk about the FAL, because it's a good example of this. The FAL is a good rifle. 20-round, box magazine fed semi-auto 308, despite what... And there's a small niche following probably for all of these guns, and there are certain people that think this gun is the epitome of everything that is right with guns and anything else is not as good. And there'll be people that think that about all different kinds of guns. Right, there are people, I think largely because of TV and media, but they think like the crossbow is the epitome of a post-apocalyptic weapon, and they'll defend that. Even though, if you look at it logically, yeah. So I'm not saying these are bad guns, but let's start with the FAL. Modern. Box magazine fed, 20-round magazines. Good usable iron sights, battle proven. It's kind of referred to, especially by people that love it, as the right arm of the free world. A bunch of different variants, but very good, very battle proven, a good operating system. So these are all good. But again, you walk into, even if you love the FAL, you'll concede that you walk into most places, most gun stores, you're not going to find a lot of FALs hanging up unless it's like one that specializes in Cold War stuff, memorabilia, and things like that. But your average gun store, even a decent sized one, is probably not, unless they have one on the used rack that got traded in, probably not going to have a lot of FALs hanging up. And there's not a lot of companies turning out new FALs. Look at the amount of companies turning out new FAL variants versus AR-15s. So, again, let's try and be sober-minded and think of why. And this was the main example that I was thinking about, pontificating. The FAL is pretty heavy. It's a heavy gun. And there's people that say, well, just man up and carry it. Yeah, but if you don't need the extra weight, and let's just say for the sake of argument, 9.4 pounds. It's not the heaviest gun in the world, but it's not the lightest either. Also, here's a big one. The ease to solidly, and you can kludge all kinds of stuff, you can make all kinds of stuff work, but the ease to solidly attach most common modern optics. And we've pretty much settled on, a Picatinny or Weaver rail, whatever you want to call it. I know there's slight differences, but for the sake of argument, you know the system I'm talking about. To easily mount a modern optic, not so easy, just by the nature of the design. And that's not a knock on when they designed it at the time in the Cold War, and I'm sure it has its roots before that, because that wasn't a common thing, right? Even when I joined the Marine Corps and went to war, and we're talking the war on terror, for the initial invasion, optics were pretty much unheard of on infantry rifles. I was an infantryman. It wasn't until later when I did other stuff in the military that I started seeing optics. When the ACOG was introduced, that was later in the war. The beginning of the war, even the war on terror, that wasn't a common thing. So it's not a knock on the designers of the FAL, but the FAL is a product of its time. Just by the nature of that, it doesn't really lend itself well to optics. Again, it's heavy. Think heavier than it needs to be. If you look at something like a SCAR, it's the same thing. It's a box magazine fed semi-automatic rifle. In my experience, far, far more accurate. Crazy accurate. It weighs 7.7 pounds. Marketably lighter, more accurate. I would say it's very reliable. I don't know, it's not as battle proven as the FAL, because the FAL was used a lot by a lot of different countries, but I don't think its reliability is in question for the SCAR. Both have not the same operating system, but they're not direct impingement if you were going to hit the AR-10 for that. So it really hasn't stood the test of coming into the modern era. Well, why has the AR-15 or even the AR-10 for that matter? Because a big part of getting away from those big battle rifles was the intermediate cartridge for the quote-unquote assault rifle, which are not crazy powerful. They're actually a lot less powerful than rifles that came before. If you look at the round-for-round power of an AR-15 versus your grandfathers or great-grandfathers at this point, M1 Garand. M1 Garand's way more powerful round for round. If you look at the average deer hunting rifle, way more powerful round for round. It's not that they're powerful, it's that they're lightweight, you can carry lots of ammo. That's kind of the appeal of the assault rifle. But even if we take that off the table, why has the AR-15 continued? Because again, 50s design. And I think this was not a knock on Eugene Stoner, a great firearms designer, genius firearms designer, but I think this was largely happenstance, right? If you look at the original design of the AR-10 or I think maybe even the early, and again, I'm not the greatest historian of this stuff, early models had kind of a finger hanging up in the carry handle, and it kind of stuck up like a finger, and you would grab that to rack it. That was kind of part of that design. Well, for whatever reasons in testing, they moved that to the side to give you the side charging handle, which kind of made that carry handle vestigial, because as most Marines and soldier infantrymen will tell you, they don't really let you carry it with the carry handle. Even though it's called the carry handle, except for some cool pictures of Vietnam, anytime that I was in or people that I knew, you weren't allowed to carry it by the carrying handle. So that kind of became a vestigial thing, a thing that was just a carryover from that earlier design feature, which meant that you could easily give it a flat top upper. Again, my first initial invasion, we still had the old school M16A2s, but going forward, my next deployment had a flat top. The carry handle mounted on top, and the better marksman, which I was blessed to be a part of. I was an expert rifleman. Initially, the ACOGs weren't mass adopted. They were given to select, at least in the Marine Corps, select troops. I was one of those. I was an early user of the ACOG. But even so, we started out with the irons, zeroed the irons, and then we put the optic on that modern flat top upper. I think the AR-15, by nature of that carry handle not being a necessity anymore and the kind of monolithic way that the upper receiver is constructed as opposed to other designs like an AK, lends itself really well to mounting an optic. And an optic is a force multiplier. It really is. I'm kind of a Luddite. I like iron sights. I like the beauty of iron sights. I like, let's say, the martial ability and the martial art of using iron sights. I really, really like that. But if I'm being honest, optics are a force multiplier. But I still like backup iron sights on a rifle, on a fighting rifle, competition rifle, for fun rifle, whatever. Competition handgun, fun handgun, whatever. Fighting handgun, same thing. Backup iron sights. But optics are for sure a force multiplier. That AR-15, I think largely just coincidentally, lends itself really well to mounting optics. And not just mounting, again, because you can kludgily mount anything. You could weld rebar on the side of a foul and bend it over somehow and mount an optic. You know, you can take a Mosin Nagant and mount an optic on it, but doesn't lend itself to that, right? You get the idea. That good, solid rail on top that you can mount, and not unless something goes wrong with the mounting system or the optic, you're generally going to hold zero. It's a good system. You know, if a Marine can beat up a M16 with an ACOG on it and not have it shift zero, that says something. So it lends itself really well to that. Also, it's lightweight, it's high capacity. It was so lightweight, I think they kind of got away from the lightweightness and even added weight to it over the years. If you look at the M16A1 to the other versions like the A4, it's gotten heavier and heavier. But it started out so light that it's still not a heavy gun. So it started out so light that it gave you the ability to add more stuff without being a crazy heavy rifle. You know, if you start out with a 6 pound and something rifle, or scratch it, I think maybe 5 pounds and something. Hold on. Okay, the original M16A1, 6.37 pounds. Right, if you compare that to a 9 pound rifle, you can add quite a bit more stuff to it, and it's still going to be lighter than that 9 pound rifle. So that is a big advantage. And I think that's why it's carried forward. And again, I don't know that this was part of the original design. Stoner, again, genius firearms designer. A lot going for that rifle that makes it great. But I think a lot of the modularity of it kind of coincidentally, like the original handguards for generations, Marines and soldiers used just the handguards. And then, because of the way you can remove those and clean the barrel and they're lightweight, you can now mount a quad rail. And moving even farther forward, you can mount a free float, M-LOK, T-Mod, pick your patch, whatever you want. I don't really care. A Samson rail, pick one. It's a good, lightweight, modern way to mount force multipliers, be that a PEC or a white light. It lends itself to that in a way that other designs don't. So the ability to bring it into current times and use of current force multipliers, I think, really lends that AR-15 and by extension AR-10 kind of design to that, where the FAL, not so much. Well, let's talk about the AK, because the AK is still really prolific on battlefields. But I don't think that's because it's the most modern. I think that's because there were so many made, and it's largely being used by second-tier nations. I don't think any first-tier nations are using basic AK-47s. There may be some exceptions like Finland and stuff like that. But most first-tier nations, the US, France, actually has a really good service rifle, the HK-416. Perhaps even better than ours. I know, I hate to say it, but Italy, Germany, Belgium, the UK, New Zealand, right? These have a lot more modern service rifles. The AK is great at what it does, and I think the reason that you still see it so prolific is it does what it was designed to do really well. It's a mass-produced rifle that's very effective, a good effective round, a good robust design, very forgiving of neglect, and really easy to train people how to use. It was kind of designed for a conscript army. And we see a lot of second-tier nations or rebels, for whether you want to be on their side or on. The AK has been used in so many different conflicts for so many different causes, whether that be horrible, evil genocide to liberation of a nation. The weapon is just a tool, but there's no doubt of the AK's effectiveness. And there are ways to modernize it, there are ways to mount optics, but it's nowhere near as easy, I would say, as the AR-15. And that's why it's starting to fade, at least with first world nations. I really like the AK. I honestly do. I think it's a great, talking about arming for the apocalypse, I think a way better choice than a crossbow. Way better choice for some scenarios than an AR-15. But if we're talking about the ability to be modernized, just by the nature of the design and the way the dust cover and the sights are constructed and things like that, it has some things lacking there. And there are attempts to modernize it, and some do pretty well. I really like the Galil Ace. I like it in a lot of different calibers and a lot of different configurations. I think it shines a lot in the smaller, shorter configurations. They have done a lot to make that upper be able to mount good modern optics, but I don't think that's as solid a mounting system because it's a lightweight, stamped metal dust cover. It wasn't designed to hold zero. It's designed to be a dust cover. So those are good. I've had them. They're good for what they are, but I still think that's not as good a design to mount optics, which optics are kind of the last several decades force multipliers more so than the innovations in the guns themselves. So we do see attempts, and even semi-successful attempts, to modernize the AK, but I think not as much so as the AR-15. We see a similar thing with the M14 or the M1A. I really like the M14. I've used the M14 quite a bit. I've also owned an M1A. I don't think the M1A is an M14, even if you get rid of the full auto capability, but it kind of suffers the same problems. And again, there's guys that are in that little niche and they're like, the M1A, the M14 is the greatest epitome of battlefield blued steel and walnut, just everything else pales in comparison. But aside from those guys, I think we can look soberly and say it suffers a lot of the same issues. It has fantastic iron sights, just beautiful iron sights. You can get good hits out to 600-800 meters with those iron sights. They're phenomenal. But again, an optic is a force multiplier. By nature of that design, and there are some like the Tanker and stuff that do like a forward-mounted scout scope option, but it's not as easy. There are workarounds, but they're workarounds. It's not as easy to just mount an optic on as a modern AR-15. And I don't think that was a forethought on either design. I think it just happened to be the way that it is. Sometimes it's just like that. Also, it's a pig. It's heavy. I know because I've carried one a lot. Let's say 9.2 pounds. And that's without an optic. That's without any force multiplier stuff, right? That's never even seen, I don't think, an M14 with a white light mounted on it for CQB stuff or for that kind of stuff, or a PEC unit, right? But you start adding that stuff on there and it gets heavy real quick. And you get to that firepower versus mobility equation, because as any grunt that served and the War on Terror will tell you, the GWAT, right? You got a lot of extra stuff besides the rifle and the ammo. It's not, like some movie Rambo where you're just running around with a knife or running around with a knife and a gun. You got body armor, which is freaking miserable. You got sometimes a giant radio. You have chow. You have water, especially if you're running around the desert. All the crazy stuff that's on the packing list that you don't really care about and probably never use, but somebody said you got to have it, so you got to have it. You get all that stuff and you're running around like a tactical Ninja Turtle and you're weighed down. And I think long ago we passed that firepower versus mobility equation, and just a heavy rifle just adds to that. And not that a 9-pound rifle is too heavy, but it's getting there. And again, you add a white light, you add a heavy optic, you add again, you can't just mount it to the top, so you got to have some other mounting system, which is going to be heavy. You talk about mounting a PEX system, an IR laser, all that stuff. Then you're getting into 12-pound rifle? That's pretty heavy. Where if you start with a 6-pound rifle and you add some stuff to it and you get to an 8-9-pound rifle, okay, that's definitely better. Here is one that I don't think should be overlooked, is cost. The cheap M14s available today are the Springfields, and they're not cheap, but they're the cheaper ones. Like if you look at like a Fulton Armory or something like that, I generally don't like to talk about USD with inflation the way that it is, but they're well north of a Cougarand if you talk about what they cost. And I'm not saying they're not buying an expensive rifle, but for that money, for a Fulton Armory, again, could you get, and you can get, I think, a SCAR 17. Very similar features, highly accurate, easy to mount a good modern optic. Now, it's got to be a good quality optic. But again, it's 7.7 pounds. And you get a lot more modern. Not only can you mount optics to it, but you got that I think, is it a quad rail? I'm trying to think about I don't have my SCAR in front of me. I think it is it's 4 rails, not the same as a quad rail on a M16 or a M4. But yeah, I can mount, and I do have mounted often a white light on there. I could mount night vision stuff on there without all kinds of weird workarounds. And this one I will go out on a limb and say, the M14 is a good, reliable gun, but I think the SCAR 17 is more reliable than the M14. If you look at the history of the M14, as much as people might love it, it's not got a reputation for being the most reliable. So we see some reasons there why it didn't stand the test of time, besides just the intermediate cartridge thing, because that's a whole different category, and there's I think, good reason for that. Now let's look at handguns. The one that comes to mind that has stood the test of time really better than any other handgun that I can think of, the 1911. It's in the name, 1911. We're talking back when we had horse cavalry. And although it's not our issued sidearm for the Marine Corps and the Army today, there are some specialized units and stuff like that, but although it's not their main issue, it's still very much alive. Right? Look at the amount of companies making a 1911 versus an M14 variant, right? Or a FAL variant. The 1911 is very much alive and with us. It's just John Browning. I mean, I don't think anybody could argue that he wasn't a genius firearms designer. But aside from it just being a great design, because there's a lot of great designs from that time period that haven't stood the test of time, why has the 1911 when others have faded into obscurity? Well, there were a lot of modern designs, although it's not as common today as the just simple later John Browning design. I think he designed the Browning tilting barrel system that we see on Glocks and M&Ps and most modern handguns. It's not far off from that way back in 1911. It has a couple of ribs on the top of the barrel. It has a swinging mechanism on the bottom, but it's still pretty simple. So you get a simple, I think a much simpler operation system than, let's say, a Luger. Lugers are beautiful, they're great guns, but they're vastly complicated. It's kind of amazing they work as well as they do with the amount of things going on in there. But the 1911, especially for its time, it may be more complicated than, let's say, a Glock, but pretty simple, especially for the time. Also, it had really good ergonomics, right? Look at the grip angle. I'd say most modern handguns today kind of duplicate the grip angle of the 1911 because it's a good natural grip angle. Also, where the magazine release is, if you look at a lot of designs of the past, a lot of them had heel releases, which for the time, you may have only had one magazine, or it wasn't like today where you're running around dropping mags on the ground. You were expected to keep track of those mags, so you didn't want to just hit the button and have it fall out. So a lot of those, again, have heel magazine releases or something lower down on the grip. The 1911, where that magazine release is, just is a great design for fast reloads, which has become a thing in modern gunfighting tactics. Whether it's a tactical reload, emergency reload, speed reload, right? That design really lends itself more so. Try doing that with a Heal magazine release. Try doing a speed reload with that. It's not as fast. And I think because of those advantages, and here's the biggest one that I know of, the trigger. Gunfighters, the trigger on a 1911 is like what everything else wishes it could be. If we're talking out-of-the-box guns. Like you get a good out-of-the-box Colt Series 70 that you can still buy today. Like a Colt Gold Cup Series 70, not even doing anything to the trigger. Just pull the trigger on it. It's a thing of beauty. It's what striker fire handguns wish that they could be. You can get close if you put a custom trigger in and do a bunch of work in, but then you're comparing apples to oranges. If you take an out-of-the-box, like Colt Gold Cup Series 70 to an out-of-the-box Glock 19, it's no comparison. It's like comparing a Ford Fiesta to a Shelby Cobra, right? It's not. They're both cars, but it's not the same experience. That trigger and those ergonomics, I think, make people fall in love with the 1911 so much that they bring it into the modern era. You could argue where something stops being a 1911. Like if I take a GI 1911 and I put on the old wartime sweetheart grips with a picture of my wife in there, is it still a 1911? Because it's not as issued. What if I take a GI 1911 and I put on some modern G10 grips? Is it still a 1911? If I do that and then I put more modern sights on it, is it still a 1911? What about an STI or a Staccato 2011? Is it still a 1911? I'd say, yeah, the basic flavor is still there. It's like if you take ramen noodles, and instead of just adding the seasoning packet, you add a little bit of olive oil and some crushed red pepper and chop up some chicken breast and put it in there. It's a way better version, way more jazzed up version of ramen noodles. But yeah, I'd say it's still ramen noodles. So yeah, the STI Staccato, and there's a lot different to a 1911, but there's a lot of similarity too. The ergonomics are pretty much still there. The modern safety, the modern magazine release, the beautiful trigger, the things that people fall in love with the 1911. They're still there. And I think those things have been so good that's why people have been bringing the 1911 into the modern era instead of just spewing it out of their mouth and it going out the pasture like so many other designs and just adopting an entirely different design. And, a Staccato or a lot of 1911s are super popular. They're not as popular as Glocks and polymer striker fires, largely going back to the costing. That's a big deal. You can get cheap 1911s. Okay. But I'd say for a good, decent 1911, a polymer striker fired that's comparable in reliability and quality is going to be far cheaper. So the cost of manufacture, going back to like the M14, like they're just expensive to produce using today's manufacturing techniques. But I think the 1911 has those qualities that just have been imitated, but they haven't been duplicated. Like if you look at what I could think of when I was trying to think of this, the next best production trigger in a handgun, I'm thinking a SIG P210, right? It's out-of-the-box trigger, not a custom trigger, just an out-of-the-box SIG P210. Has a beautiful trigger. I still don't think it's as good as a Series 70 Gold Cup, mostly because of that straight-back design. Or a Staccato, out-of-the-box Staccato triggers. I don't have any Staccatos. I was into those way before Staccato was a thing, and I have STIs, and I haven't done any internal modifications other than I don't know that I've done any internal modifications to the trigger mechanism. I've put in a short reach trigger, but that's an external modification. So just the triggers, just the way they come out of the box are just gorgeous, and that's a big part of how good a handgun is. You'll often hear like Glock apologists, oh yeah, the triggers are garbage, but everything else is good. Yeah, but the trigger's a big part of being able to shoot a handgun well. I think that and the modern ergonomics, even though they're from well over 100 years ago, the magazine release in the right place, a good rideable, which you should probably know what that means if I say a good rideable thumb safety, and just the way it was designed, even though the original sights aren't anything to write home about, there's so much purchase on the top of that gun. You can machine it, and most modern 1911s do, unless you're getting like a replica of a GI 1911. You can have really good sights, and there's even enough purchase area up there to mount a red dot. Look at that design versus trying to mount a red dot, on a Luger, for example. So I think a lot of that was happenstance, but a lot of the ergonomics was a beautiful design. And then the grips, which may not seem like a big deal, the ability to customize your grips. If you have smaller hands, to put on thin grips. If you want, you can put on bigger grips. If you have bigger hands, like the Pachmeyer old school wraparound grips. The fact that the grips come off makes it really easy to mount a magazine well, like a Wilson Combat mag well on there. Because again, back in the day, speed reloads weren't really a thing, but when they became a thing, that's a nice thing to be able to do. And although it's not standard issue for the U.S. Army, the U.S. Marine Corps, it is very, very popular still today. And if we look at why that is, I think there's more than just a sentimental attachment to Americans loving, because it's popular all over, to Americans loving the 1911. I think there's some really inherent advantages to why you would stick with that system instead of jettisoning it and going to something else. And pontificating on this, have we gotten to the useful end? Are we approaching it? Probably not anytime in the next couple of years, but are we seeing a turning of the tide with the putting out to pasture of the AR-15, of the AR pattern of rifle? Because we see the military, if they go through with it, if it continues on, if they don't jettison the program, with the M5, M7, where we did this, 50-ish, 60-ish year experiment with this super high velocity, lightweight, 55 grain to 62 grain to maybe 77 grain, but usually 62 grain, high velocity varmint round. Because that was kind of a Cold War design for a war that we never really did. For a massive ground invasion of giant uniform enemy combatants that very much fight in more traditional ways, in uniform, in fire team, squads, regiments. When they get wounded, they care for their wounded, things like that. I wasn't there for the design of the AR-15, the adoption of the 5.56, the 223. Right, I wasn't around for that, but as far as I know about history and what was going on at the time, and the Cold War and the fear of, the Red Scare and all that stuff that was going on, I think that's what was in a lot of people's minds. But what actually took place was a bunch of small skirmishes and us fighting very non-traditional, very small forces of very determined guerrilla warriors. And perhaps we saw that maybe the 5.56 was not the best battlefield cartridge ever designed. Now, I've said this before, I don't think that I would have went with the 277 Fury. It certainly has a cool name, but I probably would have went with a different thing. I've done a whole episode on what I would have done, but why should that matter? I would have went a different way, but the fact that we see the military looking at the M5, now the M7, and the 277 Fury, and getting away from that direct impingement system, because as much as you can modernize the AR-15, I think that is a drawback. And I know a lot of people love the AR-15 operating system. I'm not one of them. And I know from a technical engineering standpoint, it is actually not direct impingement. It's an internal gas piston, but most people know it colloquially as DI, direct impingement. That's how I'm going to refer to it. Let's not get too down in the minutia. But I don't like that system. I'm not in love with that system. That system catastrophically failed me in the invasion of Iraq. Thankfully, I lived to tell the tale. I've seen it fail other people, that gun. I think there are better systems. I think the short stroke gas piston system is a better system. There are some advantages, especially for like competition shooting and stuff, for the AR-15 and direct impingement. There are advantages to it, but I think for a battlefield, there are more detriments to it. And we see, really, there's not a lot of other designs that use that aside from the AR-15. There's not a lot of new guns, even in the past 20 years, despite how popular the AR-15 is, that go with that DI, whatever you want to call it, internal gas piston system. Most of them go with a short stroke gas piston, like the HK416 or the SCARs. Right? I think there's a reason for that, and I think it's a good reason. So we see that also with that M7. It is not a direct impingement system. It is a short stroke gas piston. Also, the whole buffer tube thing to me always seemed weird because I grew up shooting, and the first time I shot an M16, it was an ROTC. Even as a young boy, I shot that and thought, that's weird. I can feel that big sproing and spring and buffer tube, and the stock doesn't sweep down like almost any other stock for ergonomics. Like if the AR-15 is all you've ever known, then that maybe makes sense to you. But if you shot a lot of other rifles, that whole buffer tube thing doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. It seems to be overly complicated and unnecessary. And we see that going away on the M5, M7. So have we gotten to the end of adaptability to the AR-15? And again, this probably won't happen in the next couple of years, but is that going to slowly go out to pasture? Time will tell. I don't know. I think for now it's still a good option. It's still very modern. And there has been, over the decades, so much improvement on that direct impingement system. I don't think the system is a good system in and of itself, but I think there's been so much to get it to work properly that we've gotten to a point where it works pretty good. So for now, and the economy of scale, talking about price, if a Fulton Armory M14 is a Cougar Rand and a half and you can't even easily mount good modern optics, how many AR-10s or AR-15s could you buy with that to mount good modern optics and force multipliers? So I think for now it's still a good solid option. But are we going to see it go out to pasture? Time will tell. Time will tell. I'm not a prophet. I don't see the future. I don't know. I just like to gather around here in this virtual tribe and pontificate with you on guns. Also, I want to say this is thinking about it from a modern battlefield, first world nation perspective. I'm not saying any of these guns are bad. Guns are bad guns for you. For instance, if you're talking about, I'm a survivalist, a prepper, I don't apologize for that, some kind of post-apocalyptic, end of the world as we know it scenario, there's a good case to be made for an AK-47 with just iron sights. That will probably go the rest of your lifetime if it's a good military quality AK-47 without any maintenance, without batteries, without any of that stuff. There's a good case to be made for that. That's not the case I was trying to make here. This is going forward what's going to be continued to be mass adopted and issued by legit first world warfighting nations. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully it got you thinking about stuff other than just the marketing. And this cool thing's got cool Cerakote. And this thing is being pushed by all the YouTubers because it just came out. Hopefully you enjoy this podcast. Hopefully it is a blessing to you. I would never want you to give out of guilt. Feel free to listen to this for free. Give because you want to, because you found value in it and you want to say, hey, thanks. I appreciate your time. If that's you, consider becoming a patron. There should be a Patreon link in the show notes. I would be very humbled and blessed by that. So a mutual blessing. I get to bless you with the content, and you get to bless me by supporting on Patreon. Iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. With that, your tactical tip of the day. Tactical tip of the day. Now, I did mention that I love iron sights. I love shooting with iron sights. If you want to learn and master that martial art of riflemanship with good iron sights, good, usable, precise iron sights, which I still think is a worthwhile pursuit and will give you much discipline and understanding in the world of being a rifleman. There are some options that you don't have to spend as much as an M1A or a Fulton Armory. The easy one that comes to mind is a Ruger 10/22. They come with decent iron sights. I would argue if you want to really be a master, shoot until you're good with those. You start stretching the legs, you get out past like 100 yards with your 10/22 on fairly small targets. You might want to go to an aperture sight. Tech sights are really good. Not sponsored by any of these companies. There's a couple of different manufacturers, but get a good aperture sight set for your 10/22. Get a good decent sling for it. Learn how to shoot standing, kneeling, sitting, prone. That's a good option. If you want a more full power option, there are a few. The SKS, not the greatest sights, but they're usable iron sights. That's still a good option. It's still a good rifle. Not a great battlefield rifle, which is mostly what we focused on today, but a good all-around rifle, a good truck gun. The ammunition is widely available. Also, if you can find one at a good price, a good finish Mosin Nagant. I specify the finish on purpose. But a good finish Mosin Nagant with good iron sights, which they're known to have, and good barrels. That's a good option. Also, the Ishapore Enfield, and I specify Ishapore because they're in 308. If you don't know, that was an Enfield made in 308. And good iron sights, good operating system, that cock on closed bolt. Those are all good options, not the only ones, but really good options if you want to kind of be a rifleman with iron sights. Your tactical verse of the day, since I already said it, I'll say it again. Iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Try and remember that in our daily walk, men. A good, strong man. I do a whole other podcast called Alpha Male without saying too much about that, but a good, strong, dominant man doesn't tear other men down to make them weaker, to make himself look better. That's not the true mark of a man. A good, solid, strong man will help other men out, even at the expense of himself sometimes. He doesn't apologize for being strong. He doesn't make himself weaker, but he helps lift other brothers up as iron sharpens iron. Remember to try and sharpen each other, men. Remember to try to help each other, to bless each other. I hope this podcast is a blessing to you. With that, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.